Hi all, how are you today? Brian James back with another video, and this was a request by one of my viewers, and it's just basically how my reunions went with the birth families and my feelings about it and whatnot. So, I guess for my entire life leading up to that, it was always something like I how does a little child, like reading fairy tales and this, that, and the other thing, how does its imagination not run wild and wonder about our origins? I fail to see how anyone could go through life and not have this curiosity burning a hole in them, and especially when things go bad. Um, So, I mean, whenever I'd get in a fight with my adoptive parents, or, I was not loving them and not liking them at the time, there was always this backup that it's like, I'm not even from you people. You aren't even really my family. I have another family. And when I was little, I remember saying things like, why did you get me to be a slave for you people? And blah, 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 blah. I mean, ultimately, it gave it, and maybe this is a bad on my part that I had an excuse, to not listen to these people, and to feel as if they don't really have the right to have authority over me. So in growing up, when those scenarios arose, well, the birth family got to be the imaginary good guys, and these people got to be the bad guys. So, I mean, that's unfair, I know, for the adoptive family. Um, but you're sold the optimistic view that your mother was a selfless person to give you up. What goes unsaid is she was a young whore that, you know, had a baby out of wedlock, and her parents were ashamed of her, and so she had to give up the baby, and she wasn't allowed to keep it. But that is downplayed in the whole adoption, sales and marketing strategy. So, anyways, I mean, you grow up, and you're quite welcome to take another positive in a world where you may not be loving it. You might not be loving life. Um, I myself, I guess, looking back, and I just didn't fit with my adoptive family. Uh, you know, if they would have got a more blue collar, lower IQ, um, muscular worker type, maybe that would have worked better. My mind was just too hungry for knowledge and things, and by grade 4, I feel like intellectually I was ready to excel and move on, and these people weren't stimulating in that department. It was all physical, and they just struggled paycheck to paycheck, which I don't think was the plan for the adoptee, anyways. Um, I think as an adoptee, you're going to have to go to some wealthier people, because it should be known that the adoptee is going to require some psychological, psychiatric uh, assistance, possibly later, is going to have special needs, etc., 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 and all those things should be taken into account and are not. So again, shifting the blame from the adoptive family. They're not perfect, and by all means, there was selfishness, I'm sure, involved in the decision to have a child, just to fit in with other people that were having children at the time. So, all these things being said, there was a great wonder, curiosity, excitement put upon the meeting of the birth family later on in life. Um, there was hundreds of scenarios that would run through the mind. If a particular scenario uh, would have been like, well, I need to, I wish I knew someone in this in politics or maybe in crime or whatever, then sometimes the fantasy would manifest that maybe my birth family is a politician or a famous lawyer or a professor or whatever it may be. Maybe they could help me where these other people couldn't, or I couldn't find help elsewhere, or I was in my own failings. Maybe these are the people that will help me to reach better heights. And maybe this is where I belong and will feel at home. Because, I mean, to this day, well, I'll get into that more with the meeting of the family. So anyways, when it came down to it, when 18 years of age rolled around, um, I had had a child out of wedlock, and I had taken a year off of school before university, and that unfortunately didn't transpire because I had a child out of wedlock during that year, and it threw my life into a bit of a spiral, and needless to say, I didn't feel like the best. I didn't feel like I'd succeeded. So that being said, at 18, I didn't feel subconsciously or consciously that I was up to par to meet my birth family, and I thought I should get myself into a better situation so they would accept me better. The fear of rejection was always there because the way I looked at it is like you got one chance with these people to get back in. They've already rejected you. I mean, it's sick, twisted thinking, right? That you'd have to be of a certain caliber for your family to accept you. But the precedence already says, well, you already got thrown out with the bathwater when you were a baby. So you weren't good enough as a baby. So what is going to get you in this time? Like, you got to buy your way in, or what's going to be the scenario? So again, the whole situation leads into these psychological nightmares for the adoptee. I mean, how is a regular person without some sort of like team of people to back them up and support them and try to bolster their psyche enough to go through this process? And there's me completely ignorant, when I finally hit, I think, about 28, and just started reading random books on adoption and dove in head first and hired my own private investigator to track these people down. And Alberta in Canada is the only province where it's not required to get some sort of counseling before you go through the reunion process. So I understand, or so I hear. And if anyone knows different, please let me know in the comments below. Um, but anyway, so I hired this guy up, and I gotta tell you, like, once you make that transition from I'm going to do this eventually to I'm doing this, the the fantasy mentality now becomes a reality, and that is what triggered a nervous breakdown. Because all of a sudden, the infinite possibilities of what had taken place to cause me to be abandoned um, were coming to fruition, and I was going to get some answers fairly quickly here, and that was going to happen, and I was going to have to accept those answers, and I was going to have to face the reality and not the fantasy that I'd been dealing with my whole life. Now those are confusing and very complex issues psychologically speaking. And I gotta say, I mean, I don't think I was in any sort of place to understand what I was doing or what I was about to go through. And needless to say, it had ended in a nervous breakdown. But first things first, the birth father agreed to meet me. Now, I think I mentioned in my other video, the private detective that I tracked down specifically dealt with adoptions because he used to be a social worker that did adoptions. And from my understanding, it was guilt or whatever through the adoptions that brought him into the reunion part of it. Now, it could have been guilt, or it could have been the fact that he cashed in big time in the 70s in grabbing all these babies, and now he was cashing in a generation later, whereas all these babies were looking for where they came from, and he had access to both. So, um, you know, we all want to believe the altruistic side, but there's the selfish side is more likely to be the reason. So either which way, I mean, I don't think he was a horrible person. It didn't end up costing me a whole lot to hire him, and he did contact me years later when the birth mother finally came around. But anyway, so what ended up happening was I met the birth father. We met at McDonald's for a coffee, and we chit chatted and talked, and he wanted to talk to his wife and his children about me and that sort of thing. And then I got message from the birth mother that she couldn't meet me because she had remarried. I had a half brother, and if she met me, that the husband of that time would leave her. That was the story I got. So, um, yeah, it led to, as I mentioned, a nervous breakdown. I was always already going through a struggle, um, and that again had to do with my wife at the time ending up being a prostitute, a high-priced prostitute. I mean, that's a whole long story, but I discovered after being with this woman for 3 years that, you know, on occasion she would be booked out for a weekend, flown on a private jet, and get paid, $10,000 for a weekend in Vegas or something like along those lines. And yeah, she was also an executive assistant, and so it was it was a big blow to my ego in my late 20s. And, I had to readjust a lot of things. And at that time, in that was another trigger leading into that nervous breakdown. Um, and did I have enough arrogance and ego and conceit to carry this through to marriage, which would be a bit of a travesty and a farce, and that's what it was. So, so leading up to the reunion, it was always sort of a something I held in the bank. That if the worst case scenario, I have another family somewhere out there, and maybe I can wiggle my way back in to that scenario, and maybe they would have me back. But the terror and fear of another rejection, it never leaves you, and it's even to this day. I now see that there isn't really any going back. But in all my struggles and whatnot, I now have a little bit of a hope in that I see that through this long process that is adoption in trying to work your way out of the weeds, that you realize the process itself that you've been through is very unique, and that anyone else going through it is going to have some commonalities with you. And that's what led me into the ideology that the adoptee community should be a family and a backup for one another. And how to bring that to be and how to bring that together is one thing. Because, I mean, I see a lot of adoptees where we want our birth certificates, or we want this, or we want that. And I think the point being is that we want control over the adoption propaganda. We want the truth of adoption via what it actually does to the adoptees known, and we want we want access to those statistics, and we want access to the truth of that. And as far as the propaganda and everything goes about us, we want the power to have that information um, truthfully known. instead of pretending that, we're not being hurt en masse, because we are. And not only that, that our special needs need to be recognized within the community, um, so that if and when we decide, or if we decide not to, find our birth families and do a reunion, that we have the counseling and the support that we require before going through that process, because it's traumatic. Again, another huge traumatic occurrence that people are blindly walking into without any sort of preparation or backup, or letting people know, like, hey, I'm about to undergo this huge thing, and I'm going to require some top-notch advice and counseling. And you know what? You want to take these kids and give them a better life, which is bullshit. Um, well, then you can be responsible for all the things that are going to be attached to that process, which is a reunion down the road. Like Mr. Adoption Guy knew that, hey, well, these kids are all going to want to meet their birth families eventually, because of course you're going to want to know where you came from. How could you not? How could you not? So, anyways, the point being is, it was a huge thing for me. It was mine, but I couldn't really share it with anyone. And on top of that, when it came time for it, I was scared. I was, I felt like I wasn't good enough to meet them. Like I would be rejected again, which ultimately I guess I kind of am. And how do you tell people that you're terrified and scared when you're a grown man, and that you're regressing into your baby? You're regressing back into the child that was abandoned long ago, and to regress back into that baby. Well, you're now extremely vulnerable, and I, jail, death, institution, drug addiction, all these things are stemming from these terrible psychological uh, pitfalls that we are laden with. So, in meeting my birth mother, what did I get? Well, I didn't get a mother, but I did get an education in what happens if the adoptive mother is stunted after the adoption. Right? She's stunted at 16 or 17 years of age and doesn't grow. So this is what I got to see, and so I got to inherit a needy 16-year-old woman that is my mother, trapped in a older woman's body. You know, um, Traumatic, painful, um, scarring, and on top of all of that, yeah, I think we go into this seeking the people, like, to console us, be like, it's okay, you're home now, or something along those lines. But that's a fantasy, and it needs to be addressed beforehand, because that's not what you're walking into here. And if anything, as the adoptee, because you have had to cope with these hard things in life, chances are you have more life experience, and emotional experience, and psychological experience than the people you're about to meet, who may never have given it a second thought. They just thought, oh, well, maybe he had a better life. We do live in that secular, atheistic sort of society. So ultimately, I didn't end up meeting people that could solve my problems, or console me, or welcome me back, into the fold with open arms, because I'd been changed beyond what their family was, and there just isn't really any. There isn't putting that. You can't take that branch and stick it back on that tree, and that's the best analogy I can give. And so hopefully that answers some questions. Now, again, if you're going to meet that family, as I think you should to get at the very least closure, please prepare yourself. I cannot stress that enough, that it requires preparation. So whether it be talking to someone like myself, talking to, a counselor, but talking to someone who at least can identify and understand that this is a big deal that you're going into, uh, and not play it off like it's, oh, whatever, you're just meeting some people. That's not what it is at all. Um, yeah, maybe I need to spend some more time meditating on it myself and getting to it. But I think I've got a good handle on it, and hopefully that answered some questions for my friends. And if not, please leave your questions, comments in the bottom. Um, my situation maybe didn't end as well as I had hoped, and I hope other people have better outcomes. Maybe they want less, or maybe their family chose to grow after and take advantage of the fact that they didn't have to be responsible for a baby. So they grew into better people and were able to later on understand how psychologically their long lost child was affected. And that would be, I mean, that's ideal. And if there's situations like that, I'd love to hear about it. Please tell me in the comments. So like, share, subscribe, share with your friends. And I'll be looking for new topics for other videos, and hopefully this answered the questions that had been posed to me. Thanks. Have a great day.